It's Sunday, April 23, 2023. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we take a deep dive into the news of the week. You can support my work and get exclusive access to bonus content at patreon.com/5minute news. Joining us today is a forensic psychiatrist and scholar of violence who taught at Yale School of Medicine and Yale Law School for 17 years, but is now dividing her time between Columbia University and Harvard Medical School, having been invited to co-found a violence prevention institute. She is author of the textbook Violence and over 100 scholarly articles. She's also the editor of the New York Times bestseller The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, which predicted in 2017 that the Trump presidency, unmitigated, would vastly spread and normalize violence. Her book, Profile of a Nation, predicted in the summer of 2020 that an election alone would not take care of Trump and foresaw the January 6 deadly insurrection. Shortly before the 2020 election, she was fired from Yale for speaking up, for which she considers herself a barometer of authoritarianism. She continues to speak up as a professional and civic responsibility. Dr. Bandy Lee, welcome back to the Weekend Show.
Thank you for having me back.
Just before we start, we have a lot to talk about. We want to talk about Donald Trump's declining cognitive behavior. He's certainly very recently been putting all sorts of stuff out on Truth Social in bold capitals, and you know, I am very interested in your views on how he might have changed over recent years. But first, I know you have a few words that you've prepared that you want to say to kind of really bring this moment in history to a point. So tell us what's on your mind.
Thank you. Our country and our world are in a very serious situation with unprecedented multiple dangers, potentially even terminal dangers. Our country is suffering from what I call Trump contagion, which I'll explain further today, but it didn't start with Trump and will not end with him. Politically, economically, psychologically, and spiritually, our country may be in a kind of death spiral, which few in the know dare talk about and even fewer understand. Underlying all this is a public mental health crisis, which I and my colleagues have been warning would result if a severely mentally impaired president were not intervened with and not held accountable in time. What we're currently facing is a worldwide crisis where the empowered political leadership, further infected by Trump contagion, is not only unable to deal with today's increasingly dangerous geopolitical, climatic, and health situations, but is actively fueling the problems. As a result, quite literally, doomsday is looming with potentially unprecedented violence, suffering, and death. That is why I now use the term death spiral, which is also confirmed by the famous Doomsday Clock, which has been ominously reset to just 90 seconds to midnight, closer than any other time in history, and for more reasons than just the risk of nuclear war. My analysis as a psychiatrist is that we need mental health principles to understand the connection between dangerous leaders and the existential problems we face in order to be able to deal intelligently with the crisis. The American Psychiatric Association did the public extreme disservice when it aided Trump by campaigning to have virtually all mental health professionals removed from public forums. Its complicity is far more responsible for the mass deaths, especially with the COVID pandemic, and the decline of democracy than the public is able to recognize at this time. So just as we did after Nazism, medical professionals need to renew our ethical commitment to the public's health and our obligation to speak up against dangerous regimes, as the Declaration of Geneva mandates. That is why I have held my conferences, met with the media and members of Congress, published our best-selling book, and I'm doing this program today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, first of all. People don't want to hear this stuff, do they? I mean, you know,
Yes.
the American way, and part of the reason I moved to the United States is because it was such a positive country. And really, it's a very privileged country in as much as, you know, people have prospered here and continue to prosper. Not all people, I appreciate that, but you know, in the main, it's a very kind of economically viable and prosperous country. And people don't really want to hear from medical professionals such as yourself the kind of doomsday argument, do they? You know, aside from the Doomsday Clock, which I recognize probably not many people know much about, but that is a consensus. The Doomsday Clock is a consensus on where the world is, you know, the state of the world in terms of, you know, meeting our end. Just explain. Go on.
To go back a little bit on the history of the Doomsday Clock, it was instituted by Albert Einstein, Oppenheimer, and other atomic scientists who recognized that their knowledge of atomic science allowed them to see what kinds of dangers we are in as a society and to try to prevent it. And I'm actually glad you brought up optimism, because there is actually quite a lot that we can do, and we know how to do it. What mental health professionals have tried to do in this era is based on our knowledge of the dangers of the psychological situation we are in, that we could try to prevent the kind of doomsday scenario. Because ultimately, underlying all of what I have described are mental health issues that we can deal with on a mental health basis. And what medical professionals do well is intervene to try to help correct the situation. Dr. Bernard Lown, who also established the International IPPNW, which is the International Group of Physicians Against Nuclear War, who brought awareness to the fact that if there were a nuclear war, medical professionals would not be able to intervene, but we could speak up to the dangers of it and try to prevent it. I think prevention is key, and that's where knowledge of science and medicine helps.
You have been vindicated in so many ways with your duty to warn, which is kind of how all this started with Donald Trump's presidency back in 2016. You know, you brought about it was 27, then it went up to like 37 medical professionals. Is that right? I'm just saying from memory, because
yes, and behind them were actually thousands of mental health professionals who eventually joined.
People who instinctively knew, because of their experience and in kind of clinical work, that he was dangerous for democracy and that he posed a threat to the United States, aside from the fact that he was clearly compromised both emotionally, mentally, and in terms of, you know, the Russians and the Middle Easterns and the Chinese and everybody else that he'd had dealings with, even unknowingly, because, you know, the Russians play a long game, and they certainly kind of were using him as a mark, and, you know, that's why he kind of claims Russia, I know nothing of this. Well, yeah, that's what they do. They don't want you to know anything about it. But there was a piece written in Mother Jones in October last year. The headline was, "The psychiatrist who warned us that Donald Trump would unleash violence was absolutely right," and the subheading is "The Vindication of Bandy Lee." Just explain to us, because you've been through a lot, and it must be very hard for you, and, you know, you dropped by Yale, and the whole kind of history of this, which we know, and we've spoken before on this show. But I just want to know how it feels, because the vindication is in the public domain now. We can see it. We've experienced it. The insurrection has come and gone. Trump is up for multiple cases, from things from rape all the way through to, you know, the Espionage Act. How does it feel to kind of be vindicated in this way?
Well, vindication is a word I had heard since even a few months into the Trump presidency, and it happened again and again with every crisis, even including right after the January 6th insurrection. But what this leads to is the question: does it lead to the public becoming or being allowed more access to mental health knowledge? Because people who have been following us will recognize that not only were we among the first who recognized the true extent of the dangers of Donald Trump, of having someone like him in the U.S. presidency, but But we were correct in our predictions every step of the way, especially the magnitude of the dangers. And how were we able to do that? It is because we deal with individuals like Donald Trump day in and day out in our practice, and we understand the principles that are behind mental pathology, because we are dealing with not just normal political ideology, certainly not what is within the vast variation of human normalcy, but actually something that is destructive and quite damaging to society, which can spread very quickly. We don't think of mental symptoms as spreading, but they actually spread more quickly. Some spread more quickly than physical illnesses because we don't require physical contact in order for the symptoms to spread. All we need are emotional bonds. And in fact, with the media landscape and the social media environment, it's certainly conducive to the rapid spread of these symptoms. And what actually happened under these conditions has not surprised us and myself not at all, given my experience of working with dangerous individuals as a forensic psychiatrist. I've worked with the most violent individuals our society produces, and in prison settings with street gangs, and certainly those with severe psychiatric symptoms. And this is absolutely what we predicted.
And what we're going to talk about today is not just the pathology of Donald Trump, but of the people that support him, and how, despite all of these cases and this evidence, and the big one this week is Dominion voting systems and their case against Fox, who were spreading lies about the election. It was settled in the end for nearly $800 million, which is kind of unfortunate in a way, because it would have been nice if that case had played out, in the public domain, and people like Sean Hannity would have had to have, taken the stand and said, yeah, I knew the election was genuine, but I just said this because we were hemorrhaging viewers. So, that kind of means that this process is still ongoing. But his supporters, despite the Dominion voting systems case, despite Alvin Bragg and Manhattan District and Southern District of New York and the rape case and everything else, and Stormy Daniels, of course, this is kind of how he got into all this hot water in the first place. Despite all of this, the mindset of the people that support Donald Trump has not wavered. If anything, it has got stronger. He's been fundraising off the back of this. He's raised a lot of money just by saying, now the deep state is after me, and convincing people that, and this other kind of narrative, this parallel universe is going on. It is so detached from reality, and yet the cult seems to be growing stronger and not weaker. And to all intents and purposes, this guy will be the candidate for president in 2024, even if he's in prison.
That's right. And I think we have it somewhat backwards, in that it's not that his supporters allow him to thrive. It is that he has, in a sense, infected the population to such a degree that the most vulnerable individuals have become his staunch supporters. And we see how his ratings have gone up since the indictments, since he's been in the public eye again, and his fundraising has certainly gone up. And it is not out of possibility that he could be not only the candidate, but be elected again, which would be catastrophic for this country. So I'd like to read a quote by Carl Jung. It's from The Symbolic Life. He said, "It is not famine, not earthquakes, not microbes, not cancer, but man himself who is man's greatest danger to man, for the simple reason that there is no adequate protection against psychic epidemics, which are infinitely more devastating than the worst of natural catastrophes." we can just see how in the last 7 years, the democratic institutions and traditions of our country have been undermined exponentially with time because of exactly what we warned against, having a psychologically dangerous person in such an influential office would eventually result in the spread of social, cultural, geopolitical, and civic dangers. And that is exactly what has occurred. When Donald Trump first became president, I said that this was not a problem of an individual, that it was a public health problem. Now I'd like to emphasize that what we are seeing out as a public mental health problem out in society is a result of Trump contagion. Now, I've coined that phrase in order to emphasize that the world we see today would not have been possible without the Trump presidency. Of course, it was deteriorating already, and so the social circumstances had given rise to Trump. But what we're seeing now are the results of his Trump presidency. So now we have a cult-like figure who is dominating the minds of many, and it's not by freedom of choice and informed consent that his followers are staying by him. It's, in fact, a result of the Trump contagion. We know that there's emotional contagion, and we often talk about how laughter is infectious, anger is infectious, but in truth, mental symptoms are far more infectious than even ordinary emotion. And so we can see how it has been spreading. And fascism, I normally say, is not a political ideology, but mental pathology in politics. And we're very quickly heading in that direction.
A very simple but good example of this is the governor of California, Gavin Newsom's ex-wife, Kimberly Guilfoyle, who's a very interesting character. She dates, I think, one of the Trump sons. And you know, people say to Gavin Newsom, who's this very progressive kind of Democratic governor, how on earth could you be married to this person previously who seems to have completely changed? She has become, I mean, she famously does these speeches where she screams, about the Trumpism taking over the world. And he's like, I don't know, she just changed. Something happened. They divorced, and then she became attached to this very extreme far-right rhetoric. I mean, that's very much in the public eye. This type of thing is going on in families all around the country. People are falling out. People are going in directions that traditionally they might never have been to before. And
absolutely.
This is a mental health condition, isn't it? It's not just politics.
It's a mental health problem at societal scale. It's a great error to think that mental health problems are confined to individuals. In fact, what most people think of as mental health problems are such as schizophrenia or depression, bipolar disorder. These things are relatively innocuous at societal scale. But there are certain disorders that are societally extremely destructive, and those are the kinds that we are most worried about, and mental health professionals have the greatest obligation to warn against and speak about, because the mental symptoms that spread most quickly in society include those such as paranoia, violence, proneness, and delusions or detachment from reality through fixed false beliefs. And I think now just about anybody knows a family member, a friend, a neighbor, or someone in the community who has dramatically changed with the Trump presidency. I myself experienced it because many Trump supporters contacted me since the very beginning when I started to speak up. First, they were protesting, and some started threatening. But I always tried to engage them in the beginning, it was almost always possible to engage them starting at some kind of common level of understanding. I would often bring up my own patriotism, my study of the Enlightenment philosophies, and also my own religion, being Christian. And I also have a Master of Divinity degree. And these things would allow me to start conversations with many Trump supporters. About 3, or certainly in the 4th year of his presidency, they were no longer reachable. The vast majority of them could not get past the fact that I looked Chinese, that I must be a member of the Chinese Communist Party, that I was female, that I am a minority, and certainly could not conceive of any possibility of medical neutrality or facts that are apart from a political agenda. And this is how the presidency and those who supported Trump's presidency have changed the discourse. And we see that in the mediascape today, that we almost cannot find common ground. We cannot have a common agreement about truth. And what has happened with Fox News, we recognize that there are lies and deliberate deceptions. This is psychological manipulation. If media environments and if those with a certain agenda are able to essentially manipulate the minds of their viewers and harm public mental health, whereas professionals cannot speak in ways that would help our collective mental health, then that's a real problem, and that's a setup for the kind of psychological devolution and regression we are seeing today.
Because it's brainwashing, isn't it? I mean, that's what's happening to the nation, is being brainwashed. And the effect of that is like this 16-year-old boy who went to pick up his siblings a few days ago and goes to the wrong house because he goes to street instead of terrace, doesn't have a phone with him, can't check, just knocks on the door, and the old guy, an 85-year-old man living there, who is probably living in fear because he's been watching Fox, and he thinks that everybody who is not, white and male and cisgender is a danger to him, shoots the guy in the forehead and then in the arm.
Yes,
and thinks
it's very
that that's
tragic.
okay.
And the fact that there are almost 2 mass shootings occurring in the U.S. currently is also largely a result of the Trump presidency. We've also seen a vast increase of violence in general. There have been studies showing immediate increases with Trump's rallies, where the counties where he would hold rallies, the violence rates would go up 200%.
And the sale of guns, of course. People are arming themselves at greater numbers as well.
Yes.
Because it's almost like now he's preparing them for the moment that he is prosecuted to rise up and
Yes.
to take it very personally. And this language of they're not coming for me, they're coming for you. Just tell us a little bit about that. I mean, why is he using that rhetoric, and how dangerous is it?
Yes, in the beginning, many people thought that Donald Trump was a very clever politician with great strategy. I would not necessarily call it strategy, but it is a survival mechanism for the mental impairments that he has. And unfortunately, when someone is so disordered and so impaired that their primitive functions are uninhibited, then they become extremely adept at sensing others' vulnerabilities, especially psychological vulnerabilities, in order to prey upon them. And so it is a kind of predatory,
right? These are sales
psychological
tactics, aren't they? He's spent his whole life selling, and so when you're a salesperson, you know how to reach for people's vulnerabilities.
Yes.
You know how to close the deal, right?
Indeed. And it's not just his conscious planning and skills, but unconsciously. He will know immediately. That's how mental symptoms that come from a disorder spread much more rapidly than rational persuasion, because rational persuasion is in the cognitive brain, where our thoughts take all circumstances into consideration, can change its mind according to evidence and facts. But the primitive mind is in survival mode, and it will do anything possible to attain whatever it wishes, and essentially for psychic survival, and will do anything possible. And that, because of that emotional drive, it is more immediately powerful than trying to convince someone rationally. But of course, it almost always leads to damage and destruction. And that's why it's pathology.
In the same way that Trump doesn't know that he's a Russian asset, right? His followers don't know that they have been brainwashed, because, you're using clinical language, not completely, but, there is a clinical aspect to this that requires people to really have the skill of critical thinking, to be able to kind of understand. And a lot of people do not have that. So they'll listen to what you're saying. They'll be like, well, yeah, whatever. I just
Right.
love Trump. So let's talk about what those, how this is working on multiple levels. He doesn't know that he's an asset, and they don't know that they have been brainwashed.
Yes, and indeed, it's hard for them to recognize, because you no longer need to isolate people away on a remote island in order to brainwash them, and you don't have to torture them, or threat is enough. And in fact, positive reinforcement is more powerful and more effective in terms of brainwashing. And what they've created is kind of an isolated media sphere, where people are inoculated against listening to valid news, no matter how much they're exposed to it, because that is the method that he's used to inculcate in his following, that all other news is fake news, and all institutions are rigged against him, and that they should not believe the things they see or hear. And that's a very dangerous conditioning that he was able to do through his emotional bonds. And unless we address the source of those emotional bonds and the emotional investment whereby people will not be able to turn back, because to recognize how much they have been used and how they have been sacrificed for this, to help compensate for this leader's mental deficiencies, it would be too painful for them to recognize. So their own psychology is now working against themselves. That is why education of these dynamics is so crucial, because the only way that we can take care of our own mental health and to guard against this further devolution is to educate ourselves and to take care of our mental health. There is a way to turn it around, but in order to do so, we have to understand the principles of mental health. Just as to contain a viral pandemic, we have to know about infectious diseases. We have to apply the principles of public health. Here we have to apply the principles of public mental health and really have the input of the relevant professionals with relevant knowledge. What America does not have is psychological awareness and the importance of this entire area that is, I would argue, the most relevant area at this time. Because we can have all the political scientists and historians comment on what is happening and find patterns which are critically important. In fact, those are Those are the data we draw from to make our mental health analyses and to be able to recommend solutions. In fact, when I consult with courts or governments on policies, I make recommendations based on this kind of a collaboration with social scientists. And yet, in this situation, we are simply silenced and placed out of much of the media sphere. And that too is a sign of authoritarianism, where you take authority away from those who have the best available knowledge, those who are specialists in that knowledge, in other words, intellectuals and journalists who investigate the truth. Once you take voices away from them, from the true authorities, to take upon the authority yourself based on power, on raw power, which is arbitrary and capricious, and ultimately damaging because it's never real authority. That's the definition of authoritarianism.
We experienced this just this week. On Thursday, Elon Musk removed the Twitter authentication, the verified blue check mark. I lost mine. I've had mine since 2016. And it was a way for users to differentiate between a verified and official source versus anybody with an opinion, right? And, it's been very helpful to me to be verified on Twitter because it enables me to communicate with people and meet people such as yourself in a way that you instantly know that this is a trusted voice. This is an example of, because we initially only a few years ago we all thought Elon Musk was the greatest person, the greatest American, right? He'd shown up and was sending rockets into space, and he was electrifying vehicles and harnessing the power of the sun with Solar City and doing amazing things. The Tony Stark he was referred to. And now, as since buying Twitter, or even just before buying Twitter, where he had to find $44 billion, he might be the richest guy in the world, but just to find that kind of cash was not easy. And that's why there were some delays, and there is plenty of rumors about who helped him buy Twitter, because in buying Twitter, he has taken away blue check marks. He has increased the voices on the far right, including his own, because he's turned out to be a very, he claims to be all for free speech, but he's not. He's for hate speech. And it is an example of power and money and authoritarianism just exposed. And yet people can't really connect the dots, they don't really understand the bigger picture, which is about silencing the voices on the left and giving more credence to the voices on the far right. I'm all for voices on the right. I believe in that. But I'm talking about the far right, which is now, has become naturalized as the Republican Party and Donald Trump.
Yes, absolutely. What happened with Twitter is tragic. I myself have relied on Twitter because at one point, 3 months after the publication of our best-selling book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, we mental health professionals were the #1 topic of national conversation. And it was within weeks that the American Psychiatric Association silenced us, protecting its own federal funding, which it received windfalls of under Donald Trump. But because we were silenced from the media, I relied a great deal on Twitter, and those have followed me on Twitter also relied on it. And I imagine that's the case for many other whistleblowers and truth tellers in this era when there is silencing and suppression of voices. And that, I believe, is why Elon Musk targeted Twitter and wished to take charge of it. And I actually recognize that he had some vulnerable psychological traits even before this happened, and that he would be very vulnerable to the Trump contagion. And we see many individuals who may not have been right-wing or extremely right-wing before the Trump presidency, but who have become so because of the spread of his influence.
But did Musk change? Because I can't tell, because he's a white guy who grew up in South Africa. His father was very wealthy. He had a diamond mine, all this stuff. Then he moved to Canada before he moved to the US. It's hard to know whether his background and his history meant that he was always xenophobic. He was always, anti this and anti that, or whether he has changed since Trump.
Donald Trump himself was not always xenophobic, and he was a Democrat in the past. And therefore, these ideologies are simply what one attaches to explain or to justify one's extreme emotional drive. So I would say that truly what's underlying all of this is an issue of mental health. If we had a high state of mental health, then whatever ideology we espouse, it would be life-affirming. But on the other hand, if it's pathology that's driving it, whatever ideology we try to attach to explain our tendencies will inevitably lead to destruction of society. And that's what we are seeing at this point. The course is that we are heading toward our destruction, which is why I've called it a death spiral, and that when it is driven by pathology and not the drives for health and healing, which we know how to do and how to apply, but because we're not engaging any of that, the current course has been continued decline of our democracy and decline of our institutions and decline of our judiciary, the Supreme Court, the criminal justice system, in ways that we are not able to get our country back to a safer place, to a healthier place. So this is the state before ideology. In mental health and in our courts, in decision-making, in order to hold any job, what is required before we go into anything is mental capacity. We have to have the mental capacity to do the job or to make the decision when we refuse medical treatment. For example, if we do not have the mental capacity to refuse it, the treatment goes forth anyway if it will save the person's life, because there is a chance that they can regain their mental capacity. And given their mental capacity, they would have consented to the treatment. And of course, psychiatric illnesses are often this way. So education about these matters is key, and getting our society back to a place where it won't be so overtaken by mental pathology so as to enthusiastically advocate for their own decline and demise, which is what mental pathology causes one to do, then we will have started to address the real problem. I know this is rather serious language to go into, but I say so because the problem is very clear. The solutions are very clear. Mental health experts throughout the Trump presidency have said since early on how we can intervene. In the first few months of his presidency, we could have even convinced him to resign. We could have convinced Vladimir Putin not to invade Ukraine. These are very apparent to us because we are used to dealing with these mental impairments. And we know how to intervene with them. They operate, the dynamics are different from healthy individuals. But to assume that they are healthy and to treat them as if they were healthy is the last thing you wish to do with these individuals, because they'll make use of that and entirely weaponize it, which they have.
This is what frustrates me the most, is how this behavior has become normalized.
Yes.
And it's been normalized by Fox, obviously, by the way that they broadcast and they legitimize the former president. Not just them, but news organizations all around the world. I mean, I could even be critical of the BBC in the UK, where instead of laughing the guy off the stage in the first 2 or 3 days, they actually took what he was saying as gospel, and they could have called it. But because we respect democracy and we respected that vote in 2016, we therefore want to give him the benefit of the doubt. Even Obama said, let's hope he rises to the occasion. Well, of course, that was never going to happen. But the downside to this kind of system of respecting the vote and respecting democracy, even though that we now know that Cambridge Analytica and, the Russian influence and everything else probably helped Donald Trump get elected, and there's a very good chance that he would have lost to Hillary Clinton by a few percentage points had there not have been this drive on Facebook and through social media and brainwashing people, using these techniques that we've discussed. But I don't want to get into the legitimacy of his election, because he got elected. He took advantage of that. And news organizations and journalists, who a lot of whom have now apologized and regret the way that they covered him, because it seemed to me that no one knew how to cover this guy. They legitimized his presidency. And I was out on day 3 or 4 when he banned the Muslims from entering the country. I was out. I was like, right, this is not normal. And yet it has become normal. And it continues to be normal. And the fact that he can be considered as a candidate by the Republican Party, who have normalized him, the GOP have normalized him enough, they're prepared to overlook all of the insanity and the danger and the doomsday because they think that he is a winning candidate.
Yes, and as you can see, our attempts to respect democracy, our attempts to keep with the rules of civility have actually allowed him to demolish democracy and to make this the most violent first world nation there is, in terms of going beyond any kind of uncivility. And that is why in a true democracy, we would have allowed the public to be educated on the relevant issues. Now, mental health professionals don't always need to speak in public. And in fact, I never have in my, prior to this 20-year career. And yet, when it becomes a central issue, it needs to be talked about. But because what we had to say was so relevant and what the public needed, the powers that be, because we were somehow not a complete democracy, the powers that be needed to silence us. And that's why we were the first to be silenced and the only experts to be silenced in the area of our own expertise.
We have to take a quick pause for our sponsor, but I'm very keen to talk about Trump's mental decline, because that's what we're seeing now in his Truth Social posts and everything else. So we'll come back and talk more in just a moment with Dr. Bandy Lee. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. It's so easy to get caught up in what everyone else needs from you and never really take a moment to think about what you need from yourself. I know in my own life, I've dealt with a lot of different factors, and I've used therapy to express myself, understand myself, and learn a little bit more about what's going on in here. When we spend all of our time giving, it can leave us feeling stretched thin and burned out. Well, therapy can give you the tools to find more balance in your life, so you can keep supporting others without leaving yourself behind. You see, with therapy, it's helpful to learn positive coping skills and how to set boundaries and, generally speaking, how to become the best version of yourself. And by the way, therapy isn't just for those who've experienced major trauma, it's for everyone, because what you're going through matters. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Find more balance with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/weekendshow today to get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp, HELP.com/weekendshow. It's the Weekend Show. I'm Anthony Davis, and we're with Dr. Bandy Lee. On the 5th of April, you wrote on your Substack, the majority of the population is not well educated about the psychological dynamics that govern either themselves or the public at large. Indeed, such information is actively suppressed in public discourse. However, those who desire to dominate are very well aware. Indeed, dominance and control themselves are forms of psychological abuse. Donald Trump's psychopathology works extraordinarily well for both distraction and disempowerment. Psychological warfare is an even more powerful weapon than bioterrorism. I mean, that's what we're kind of seeing now, isn't it? We are now in a space where, and Russia, I'm sure, is very happy about this, where America is at war with itself. And so they have been successful. In a way, they have caused this kind of public discourse. Just tell us a little bit about this.
Well, Russia is very accustomed to and well versed in what you might call psychological warfare, because it's been waging it against its own population since the Soviet era and probably hasn't stopped. And the fact that America was not at all aware of this kind of nefarious operation. It completely fell victim to it. And even if they did not change the actual votes or didn't meddle in an election, it changed the psychological structure of so much of the population that it no longer needed to meddle in any way. In fact, many have been conditioned for probably their lifetimes to do as the Russian agents wanted Americans to do. And the only antidote to that is to educate ourselves, improve our mental health, and ultimately the cause is socioeconomic, in that it's really the rising inequality and what I call structural violence that has given rise to the current state of poor public mental health, that we would succumb to this kind of manipulation and have succumbed to this kind of collective disorder, if you will. Many have called it a collective psychosis. It has been seen in the past before. That's what Carl Jung was referring to as the psychic epidemic. And I've been calling it the mental health epidemic, the mental health pandemic that was underlying and worsening the viral pandemic and is more serious than the COVID pandemic. And that needs to be addressed. Otherwise, it's going to continue to spread exponentially. That's what pandemics do. Unless we contain it according to the principles of science and the best available knowledge that we have, it will continue to spread. But the good news about that is that we can prevent it. Whatever we do at this time, if we do it correctly, if we apply the scientific principles and what we know about mental health dynamics, we can prevent this and we can diminish it. We can even eliminate it. That is what, that is the knowledge that we have currently in mental health, but are unable to apply it because
but it's a huge undertaking, isn't it? It's a huge undertaking because, you know, everybody is affected by this, and stopping short of us all kind of checking in and, you know, with a therapist and you know, really like talking this out.
That's the beauty of public health interventions, is that very small, extremely inexpensive interventions at the top can produce enormous changes fairly quickly. In fact, the World Health Organization, which I had been consulting with since 2002, had done a study with a number of other UN organizations of documenting how 133 countries implemented laws, programming throughout the nation, and changed policing and so on in ways that were prevention-minded rather than intervention and reaction-minded. And they found that they were immediately able to reduce globally, this is truly significant, 16% of interpersonal violence, mostly homicides, 16% had gone down in 12 years. That's an enormous amount for the world, and given that it was consciously done. And of course, since that time, we've become somewhat complacent, but we could do it again. And in fact, the UN Sustainable Development Goals include a lot of measures we can take to reduce violence. And when we reduce violence, and structural violence above all, because structural violence is the deadliest form of violence, it causes more than 10 times the death of suicide, homicide, and warfare combined, then we can see not only a vast reduction in deaths, in violent deaths, but injuries, physical illnesses, as well as mental illnesses. And this is what... I
think AOC's been talking about this recently, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's involved in a program to bring down violence by using a more kind of critical approach. And I totally understand that the evidence is there. The problem is that America would politicize that. So if Joe Biden came up with it, the Republicans would claim that it was just a way of trying to, reduce Republican votes. They would kind of claim that it was a conspiracy. And so because there isn't the consensus in the United States, and because there is this division, the types of programs you're describing, I mean, we can't even get like climate change stuff away. That's the tragedy, isn't it? Because the planet is putting out all of these examples of how things have changed. Florida was underwater this last week, and now they're talking about how they were testing for fecal matter in the water supply, and it's like 40% more than it should be because of the flooding. I mean, that's climate change, and yet Ron DeSantis thinks it's Democrat stuff.
That's why it's important for policymakers to consult with us, and I hope they still will, behind the scenes. All of what has happened, all of what has gone wrong since the Trump presidency could have been dealt with more effectively, or perhaps it's being dealt with effectively depended on consultation with mental health experts. I would honestly be able to state it that way. As they did in the beginning, in the very beginning, more than 50 members of Congress consulted with me and my colleagues, and we were very well on our way to having a proper intervention. Again, it's the effect of the American Psychiatric Association that put a clamp on that. But the 2 impeachments, his conviction, all of that could have been dealt with and could have been successful if we dealt with it as a psychological problem and as a mental health problem. All that we're seeing, all the institutional breakdown, everything that is happening that is not working, in that politicians are destroying the country rather than safeguarding the country, all of this can be explained in mental health terms. That's how
experts are being devalued, aren't they? I mean, that's the sadness here, that the value of an expert. I mean, look at Dr. Anthony Fauci. There is nobody who has that kind of experience, that kind of lifelong commitment to public health and public service. And yet he has been painted as a demonic creature from, the darkest depths of hell from the Republican and MAGA Republican perspective. They think he caused the pandemic. They think that he's a fascist because he tried to make people get vaccinated. I mean, if Fauci can't get this stuff away, then what hope is there for anybody?
I would say that there is no limit. The power of the mind is such that it can distort and deny and restructure reality to suit its emotional needs. And that is what we need to address. When the emotional needs exceed any ability, reason, and institutional ability to continue standing, because what we are recognizing more and more is that political institutions, judicial bodies, all of these things are dependent on not only social support, but collective mental health. And that is where the mental capacity principle applies everywhere. In fact, it does apply everywhere, except in elected office. Anyone in any job, we see signs of mental incapacity or any incapacity. They could be required by their employer, by the government, by a court to pass a mental capacity evaluation before going further, because we presume mental capacity. But once there are signs of impairment, we can bring them to account at that level. But only elected office do we not have that. And we can see why those in power would not wish to be called out in that manner. But that's something that citizens could demand, and they should. For the democracy to function normally, citizens should actually demand that the standard basic requirements that is required of everyone else, even someone taking out the garbage, if they don't have the capacity to do so, they're unfit for the job. And yet the person who commands nuclear weapons is not required to pass such an examination. So I know that mental capacity tests have come up, especially from right-wing candidates. And I would say that it is a valid thing to bring up. It would not compromise democracy, given that the public is given all the information, allowed to be informed, because the Soviet psychiatry or the abuses of Soviet psychiatry or Chinese psychiatry happened under conditions of ignorance. Under ignorance, expertise is always exploited. We see that currently with any other field. It's exploited. Ronnie Jackson himself, who was the White House physician who declared Donald Trump fit when he did not have the training and he did not have the independence or the position to be able to do so, and yet he did so.
And his true colors have been exposed now, haven't they? Because Ronnie Jackson is nuts. I mean, he really is absolutely on another planet, and he was the one that gave Trump this test, which was, man, woman, person, camera, TV. And Trump thought, the fact that Trump was so proud of himself for being able to relay these things from the list, to him, that was more of an achievement than, bringing peace to the Middle East. He really felt vindicated, and the reality was that everybody knew that the test he'd been given was a joke. And so, that in itself, just his response and his reaction to that test, to me, was the real test to prove that the guy is unfit for office.
That's right. I usually give the test to detect impairments, because if anyone gets anything wrong, they are so impaired that they may need to be in a nursing home, that I never use it to rule out serious dementia. But that kind of disinformation and psychological manipulation of the public is abuse of authority and abuse of expertise. And true democracy would allow the public to be fully informed and have full access to not only facts, but the best available knowledge from intellectuals and journalists. And the fact that the public is not only deprived of this knowledge, I can tell you from a mental health standpoint, the public has been entirely deprived, left or right wing, whether their sources are left or right wing. And this is happening in many areas. And not only that, those who would wish to seek out information is conditioned so that they would not access, or they would dismiss information that could potentially inform them about the truth. And those are the mental health dangers that truly have come to the point where critical intervention is needed. But it is still possible, and there are many mechanisms that we can make use of, but mental health experts do need to be consulted.
Let's talk about Trump 2016 and Trump 2023, because there has clearly been some decline, cognitive decline, there's physical decline. Obviously, he's older and will be even older if he runs and wins the presidency. This isn't really about age, is it? This is more about, how he himself has gone further down the rabbit hole, because he loves publicity. He's a kind of marketing genius, and he knows that repeating the message over and over, in the same way that Adolf Hitler did with his speech making, Trump has learned that really does kind of sell the message. But my concern is that he's now desperate, because he is finally, the law has finally caught up with him. And, that's why he's using this explicit language to criticize Alvin Bragg, to accuse him of reverse racism. He hates the fact that Letitia James and Bragg himself and Fannie Willis, these are black people that are, finally, these are the people that have kind of bringing him down, as well as Stormy Daniels is a porn star. I mean, it infuriates him, but there's nothing he can do about it, because there is so much evidence against him. And he consequently is writing these posts on Truth Social in all caps, using the type of language that you wouldn't use in secret, let alone about somebody who is seeking to prosecute you. So he's not doing his case any favors. How far has he declined?
But he also understands very well, more so than the public and those in power, that he can subvert the legal system, the judicial system, in ways that it will no longer function, which is what he has done.
And he's done his whole life. I mean, he could have been... I mean, it's amazing that he hasn't been caught for anything serious before, because, he's been involved in so much illegal activity throughout his life, and he's bullied people and he's sued people and to maintain control and power. But you're right, he is devaluing the institutions in order to get away with it again.
That is why he is more dangerous than ever. He is more dangerous now than he was in 2016. And he has certainly made our culture far more dangerous and more vulnerable to him. Many people ask me, has he deteriorated over time? What we've been seeing, certainly he has deteriorated, but what we're seeing is not a change in him. He's always had these mental impairments that would predispose to this kind of deterioration. But what has done this is handing power to such an individual who is not able to handle this kind of power, but would abuse it, corrupt it, and in fact bring the entire society down rather than function within that power system. That is, so individuals like Donald Trump are actually quite common. I've seen in the upwards of 1,000 such individuals in my practice of specializing in treating violent offenders. And so oftentimes when you're not treating these individuals the way they need to be treated, in other words, through limit setting, through severe restraint, containment, because they don't have any internal restraints, what will happen is that their megalomania and their abuses grow out of control. And that's really, and the problem is that there's kind of a synergy that happens between him and similar mentally impaired similarly mentally impaired individuals out in society. And so a kind of symbiosis forms, the attraction is magnetic, and very soon we see a proliferation of mini Trumps. And they have their own symptoms that they will spread through public exposure. So this is the kind of danger that we were facing, that was always psychological, still is psychological, and can be dealt with psychologically. But it has to be dealt with this psychological dynamic in mind, or even the criminal justice system will not work. The legal system will not work. It so happened that that the rise of Trumpism, or the Trump contagion, happened. It happened rapidly, but happened over a relatively short time. That the judiciary wasn't yet affected right after the 2020 election, when he tried all kinds of legal means to overturn the election. But over time, we're going to see it weakened further and further. I'd like to note that the reason I was able to predict the outcome of what would happen after the 2020 election, what I said in Profile of a Nation, Trump's Mind, America's Soul, which I published in the summer of 2020, was that he will likely refuse to concede the results, call the election a fraud, and refuse to leave office. And that's precisely what he did, regardless of election results. And what people don't realize is that the 2020 election brought him more votes than 2016 because of the spread of the Trump contagion. And we have not properly contained it. In fact, among his followers, it has spread even further. And truly, we're facing a more dangerous case of Donald Trump, and time is running out. And so we have to deal first with the source of the problem, which is Donald Trump, who in fact also was a product of many problems in our society. But the source of the contagion is he, and there are key points at which we need to intervene, not just him anymore, but those he has empowered, enabled, and who are similarly mentally impaired as he also need to be intervened with. And this is, this would be best dealt with as a public mental health problem, which leaders can consult with experts on without needlessly politicizing the issue.
But it's the enablers that I'm very interested in, because people like Mitch McConnell, who wield a lot of power in the GOP, obviously, he has said that he will back whoever is the candidate, right? So without mentioning Trump's name, he knows exactly what went on. He condemned Trump after the insurrection. He's a very sharp operator despite his years, and he had a fall recently, which seems to have affected him quite a lot. But, it only takes someone like Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy to come together and go, no, we're done with this guy. But they won't. Now, they won't because they know that he is box office. They know that he is, and they're terrified of him as well, because he is.
That's right.
He has compromat on them, or he'll just make stuff up, and he'll paint them in a very bad light. What is it about, Trump's appeal to them to use him to get to the ballot box? Why is it that they're prepared to overlook all of the contagion, as you describe, for power and for a win? Because these people do have the ability to stop this dead in its tracks. There's plenty of senior Republicans who can collectively go, okay, we need somebody else. But they're not. They're just running with this.
Yes. And who would have imagined a couple years ago that Donald Trump would again be a viable candidate? That's the influence of the Trump contagion, that the emotional contagion that has not been contained, and yes, they understand and recognize the power of that because they have been making use of that power themselves. They have been using psychological means, manipulations. That is how Mitch McConnell, as a representative of 1% of the American population, was able to determine the entire course of politics in this nation, and probably is responsible for Donald Trump himself. Certainly is responsible for the current Supreme Court that we have. And if you compare their reactions shortly after the January 6th insurrection to now, you can measure the influence of the Trump contagion and how powerful these mental health principles are, whether they like it or not. We learned from the Fox News reports that from the lawsuit that they essentially didn't believe anything, any of what they were saying. They truly believed Trump was nuts. They didn't like him even, and yet they were trapped. And
well, he's a meal ticket for them, isn't he? He is the golden goose, and continues to be.
And that is for psychological reasons and psychological pathology reasons. And that is why when you need surgery to cure a terminal disease, you need to perform the surgery. Currently, what we need is a mental health equivalent of a surgery. And our whole society is dealing with it blindly and falling victim to it every time.
I have a final question for you, and that is the elephant in the room, which is Ron DeSantis. He has been influenced by Trump, as well as the kind of far-right operators, Christina Puschel and people that are operating him. He is trying to take his extremist Florida policies and thinks that they'll work on the national stage. I hope that he's unsuccessful, but I also recognize that Trump is not going to allow Ron DeSantis to be the candidate for president 2024, is he? I mean, he feels a lot of threat. He feels a threat from DeSantis, and he will deal with a threat in the only way that he knows how.
Yes. Yes, I won't comment on individuals specifically, but Ron DeSantis seems to me to be an example of the spread of the Trump contagion. He's certainly a product of it. And certainly when he brings a different style, and those who are tired of the chaotic style of Donald Trump would gravitate toward him. But you might recognize that even though he has many of the same characteristics that Trump himself does, regardless of the difference in style, that's where these psychological features and characteristics can infect anybody, no matter how well educated they are, and no matter how proper their style is. That they will make choices that will continue to bring the society down this spiral, and will be very attracted to policies and mechanisms that will achieve that goal, because the goal of a disease is destruction and demise eventually, and regardless of the ideology they purport to espouse. And that's why having basic mental health, perhaps one day we will require mental capacity evaluations of all candidates so that they do not infect the public with the kind of pathology to start with, because that will spread much faster and farther than any kind of rational strategy. So it's a kind of setup for this kind of psychic epidemic that we have been seeing, and that Carl Jung distressed about what many mental health professionals have warned against in the Trump era, and what is now placing our society at existential risk.
Okay. We have to finish. I could talk to you all day about this, and that actually is an interesting thing, isn't it? Because, you know, people will say, how can you why do you keep talking about Trump? Like, if you stop talking about him, surely he'll go away. And, you know, for me anyway, I will never stop talking about this, because I recognize the existential threat that you have described, that I feel in my, instinctively in my gut. I felt the same thing about the Brexit vote in Europe, and I didn't stop talking about Brexit even long after people were bored hearing about it. And I was vindicated, because that has been a total disaster for the United Kingdom. So here, now in my new home of the US, I care passionately about maintaining a democracy. I am proudly pro-democracy. And I just, I see Trump as the antithesis of that, and
we can't stop talking
about
him, but we have to talk about him in the right way,
yeah.
And certainly diminish his public presence.
Okay, Dr. Bandy Lee, thank you for joining the Weekend Show.
Thank you again for having me.
You can hear more from Bandy Lee at her website, bandylee.com, and also you can sign up to her Substack. The details will be at the bottom of this video. I'm Anthony Davis. Thank you for joining me today. Please subscribe to The Weekend Show on YouTube or as an audio podcast, and also support me on Patreon at patreon.com/5minutenews for exclusive videos and bonus content. The daily podcast drops every morning. You can hear me tell you what's going on around the world. And join me next week with a brand new special guest and 3 more factual news stories to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with MeidasTouch.